Okay, good morning everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Today we're going to talk to Dr. Mike Egan from Teagasc Moor Park in relation to studies that he did over 3 years from 2017 through to the end of 2019 in relation to closing cover and the importance of trying to close in time to make sure that there's adequate cover there available for the springtime, which is obviously an important time for spring calving dairy herds. But it's trying to get the balance right, trying to make sure that we provide plenty of grass into the back end of the year, but also make sure that we have adequate grass at the start of the following or for the following season as well, which is obviously a critical time in terms of energy requirement for dairy cows and so forth. So Mike, I'll ask you to present your screen there to show your presentation. It's about maybe 20-25 minutes of a presentation, and then we can take questions and answers as we go along. After that, if a question does come, Mike, that's kind of appropriate at the time in the presentation, I might put it to you as we go, rather than holding it.
That's fine.
That's okay.
Can everyone see this? You can see the screen there, Stuart, yeah?
Yeah, that's perfect. No, Mike, yeah. Work away.
Yeah, so thanks very much. I'm just going to present data from a project that we were doing here in Moor Park for the last 3 years, and I suppose the title of that project was The Effect of Autumn Closing Management and Spring Rotation Plans on Animal and Sward Characteristics. And there was 2 PhD students working on this, Ashton Claffey, who has since graduated with her PhD, and Caitlin Looney, who's in the final few months writing her thesis at the moment. But just suppose a little context on why we set this up. There's huge backlog of research looking at the positive influence of having high quantities of grass available in cows' diets in early lactation, how it increased protein content in the milk, and as Stuart was saying there, can meet a high majority of the energy requirements of cows. But when we looked at national ICBF data up until 2018, and the trend has continued for 19 and 20, the top 10% and even the national average, there was a 7 to 8 day reduction in mean calving date for cows in the country, coming from the 10th of March nationally back to the 25th of February, and even the top 10% even further. Couple that then with a increase in the percent of cows calved in the first 6 weeks of the calving period. Again, likewise over the same time period, you can see the same trend increasing nationally from about 53% up to about 64-65% in 2018, and the top 10% from 66% up to 75%. And that then with, I suppose, an additional 150,000 dairy cows in the system, some of those gone on to existing platforms, has pushed stocking rate up on farms dramatically. So what this means is there's a huge amount of pressure, or increased pressure, that wasn't there 10 years ago for high quantities of forage or grazed grass available in the spring period for cows. So we are going to get deficits in farms in spring period if we don't have enough grass. And there is a lot of evidence to support out there that a lower daily herbage allowance will reduce the post-grazing sward height in spring, which will in fact limit grass production. And it will have a short-term impact on animal performance, but long-term they do recover quite well. When we looked at pasture-based data on top of that, then we have seen from the last couple of springs that there's a huge variation in the amount of spring grass growth rate. So this is growth rate from the end of January to the end of April over a 4-year period. And you can see there's a huge variation amount of grass that were growing on farms during this period. Likewise, when we looked at opening farm covers, so although we had a tighter calving pattern, more cows calved earlier in the spring, we didn't see an increase in opening farm cover on pasture-based data in the same time period, and if anything, opening farm cover was slightly beginning to reduce because of grazing further into the autumn period. So we wanted to set up a study to try and capture some of the impacts that if we lower our opening farm cover too low in the spring by altering our autumn grazing management, or likewise increase our opening farm cover in spring, what impacts will this have on late lactation milk production, herbage production, overwinter growth rates, and the subsequent animal and herbage production in spring? So there's 2 parts to this. I'll go through the autumn part of the study first, and we move on to the spring. But suppose what we had set up in the autumn was a 3-factorial design. So we had 3 autumn closing dates. I'll bring up those dates in a minute. The stocking rate of all those systems were the exact same at 2.9 cows per hectare. So all concentrate supplementation was the exact same, and the only difference that there was in feed allowance was silage that was fed to the cows. So 3 autumn closing dates, and this trial or this part of the study ran from early September until early December, so a 13-week period. So these are the 3 autumn closing dates or closing plans that we had in place. So if you look at the normal or the brown rotation or treatment in the middle, so this is our standard autumn closing budget. So our closing planner, start your final rotation somewhere around the 7th to the 10th of October, have 60% of your farm closed or grazed by the 1st of November, and finish grazing then or house the cows somewhere around the 24th of November. So we wanted to capture that and look at 2 extremes then as well, going 2 weeks later, so not closing until the 25th of October, 60% grazed by the 17th of November, and cows are not housed until the 9th of December. And the opposite then, 2 weeks earlier, we started closing ground on the 25th of September. We had 60% closed by the 17th of October, and finished grazing, or the cows were fully housed on the 9th of November. And I suppose we got the late lactation milk production, but we really wanted to look at how this would impact opening farm cover and how much grass would we have on these farms the following spring. So, yeah.
Sorry, you might just clarify. I suppose there's probably a perception out there that our target closing, as in when we talk about closing cover, we always we're targeting the 1st of December, and I suppose just that isn't actually the date of housing. Just to clarify.
Yes, so when we talk about housing date and closing farm cover, they're 2 completely different things, because the date that I house the cows here in Moore Park or someone houses the cows in Ballyhaise is completely different. But if we want to get a common parameter of what our closing farm cover should be, it has to be on a common date. And the date that we would suggest, and we have talked about over the last number of years, is the 1st of December. So regardless of what date you house the cows at, your closing farm cover should be done on a common date, and that date is the 1st of December. Because if you house the cows on the 1st of November, you can have a very, very low closing farm cover at that date. But the cover that you will have on your farm the following spring is extremely high, even though your closing farm cover was low. So having that common date of a closing farm cover of the 1st of December, it just kind of gives the whole thing, when we talk about certain targets for your closing cover, it's on a specific date, not on the date that you house the cows.
And the dates for the late grazing group then, we'll say, would that have the 9th of December when you did actually house, you'd have done another cover there after the 1st of December cover?
Exactly, yeah. So we would have done covers every week on these, and even over the winter we would have done them as well. So the closing date, even though it was the 9th of December, we still did a cover on the 1st of December, but we looked to see what we had dropped that over the preceding 9 days. And to be honest with you, the amount of grass that we were grazing over that 9 days was quite low. So it only dropped it by about 25 kilos of an average farm cover over that period. But again, when I talk about closing covers or targets later on in the presentation as well, it will be as of the 1st of December.
Okay, thanks for that.
No trouble. So just I suppose a target opening farm cover that we had for these, I have high, medium and low wrote there. So what we had targeted for these in terms of what we had budgeted on getting an opening farm cover was somewhere around 1,050 for the high or the early close treatment. For the normal or the medium treatment, we had somewhere around 850. And the low close treatment, because of the later start date and later housing date, 650 kilos of opening farm cover. That was the following February on the 1st of February the following spring. But when we actually looked at the opening farm covers that we had on these, and we have the growth rates there on those as well, there was a huge variation across the 3 years. So the 3 springs that we had, the 17, 18 and 19, there's a huge variation. So if we just look at even the early on its own first, so the first 2 years we kind of achieved our target of 1,050 kilos of dry matter from the exact same closing date, but because of the exceptionally high soil temperature and overwinter growth rate that we got in the winter of 18-19, we had an exceptionally high opening farm cover of 1,400. So although we did the exact same thing, we increased opening farm cover by 1,400 the following spring. Likewise then on the normal close treatment, so the first year we achieved our target of somewhere around 800 to 850 kilos of an opening farm cover. The second year then, you can see here we are at a much lower growth rate and a much lower soil temperature, so it had a much larger impact on the opening farm cover on the medium and the late closing treatment. So it reduced it by 200 kilos, And likewise then, because of the high overwinter growth rates and high soil temperatures in the third year, again, it increased our opening farm cover up to 1,080. So even though we had a 2-week later start closing date for the normal treatment in year 2, we still achieved the exact same opening farm cover as we did in the early treatment in the first 2 years. And I suppose the results here are as an outcome of the trial, but it just goes to show the highlight that just by going on a date parameter as your closing farm cover, dates and set dates every year, the huge variation that you can get on those treatments. And likewise then, when we look at the late close treatment in the third year, we had an 800 of an opening farm cover, where we had 650 and 400 the following the first 2 years. So it just goes to show that although we can do the exact same thing every year in terms of dates and housing pattern, because of the large variation that you're going to get in overwinter growth rates, overwinter rainfall and soil temperature, it is going to have a huge impact on the amount of grass that you have on your farm the following spring. So, and I'll bring it back again later in the presentation, but we probably need to move slightly away from a specific date target in terms of our closing rotation, and move towards a target closing cover and opening farm cover that we require the following spring, rather than doing the exact same thing every year.
Bit more dynamic.
I think we have to be more dynamic and just change, regardless of what we have written in the diary or on the planner. If growth rates are exceptionally high, like we had in 18-19, there's a possibility to continue grazing for another week or 10 days in the autumn, not to have that exceptionally high opening farm cover of 1,400. Or likewise, if growth rates are quite low, we need to cease grazing early, regardless of what we have in the diary, so we can protect that closing farm cover and opening farm cover for what we require on our farm as much as possible. So we do need to be a lot more dynamic rather than just sitting to the one thing every year.
Yeah.
And then this is just the last thing I present here now on this slide, but this is just the effect of, so every day delay in closing, how it impacts the amount of grass that we have in spring. And obviously, if we close on the 1st of October versus the 1st of December, a paddock is going to have a lot more grass on the 1st of October versus the 1st of December when we come to the following spring. But what impact does that have? So when we look at it over the 3 years on every paddock that we had in terms of the closing date, the overwinter growth rates, and the amount of grass that we had the following spring, every day delay that we didn't close the paddock from the 25th of September to the 9th of December, it reduced our opening farm cover by 16 kilos. So I suppose what that means is, if we, versus the 1st of October versus the 10th of October as a start closing date, that's 10 days. That's going to reduce our opening farm cover by 160 kilos of dry matter per hectare the following spring. So those extra 10 days can impact the following spring by 160 kilos of a lower opening farm cover, which in the spring period equates to about 4 to 5 days grass availability in February for cows on farm. And look, some of the previous research would have suggested where it would have been slightly lower than what we would have had of 10 to 15. But again, it's all within the range that every day you delay, it's going to reduce the amount of grass that you have on farm.
And is your figure slightly buoyed by the fact that you had 2 very good year back ends?
It is, and if we excluded 2018-19, it brought that figure back to 15.1.
Okay. So in line with Mick's original figures.
Yeah, so in line with the data from 2002, but much higher than Dave Lawrence's work in 2017. But that's because we had exceptionally high growth rates in 2019. And you're going to get those variations. But again, if we looked at 2019 on its own, it was up at 18.5 kilos for every day delay. So there's a huge variation that you're going to get across years. But I guess the best data that we can get is multi-year approach. And that's why we ran this over the 3 years to get that variation. But it's going to be somewhere around that 15 to 16 kilos of a variation in every day anyway.
Yeah, and I suppose the key point is that it's 150 kgs over 10 days. So, and as you said, it's the equivalent to 4 to 5 days of grazing. That's the big thing really in the springtime.
Yeah, it is. And so, and we saw that in 2018 after the drought, with the high growth rates and the very good soil or ground conditions, people grazed probably a little bit longer than previously, and it did reduce overwinter growth rates. In 2018 it did reduce opening farm covers on some of those farms that did reduce or continue grazing much longer. So a week in autumn, continue grazing a week in autumn because ground conditions, and I've heard of many farmers and people use it or lose it. I'm going to graze it because I lose it. Otherwise, it's okay on a very high up closing paddock that you have over the winter and you carry it. You may lose 5 to 10% of it through senescence, but you'll get new leaves coming out as well. So although you're getting a lot of senescence at the base of the sward, there's an awful lot of new leaves coming out at the top of the sward as well that we have to take into account. So you may lose 5 to 10% in senescence, but versus grazing it and reducing your farm cover by 15%, it has huge implications the following spring.
So you're possibly, we'll say, for example, if you had a cover of 13 or 1400 that you're carrying, which is on the upper end, I suppose, you're going to lose potentially 140 kilos per hectare on that paddock, as opposed to the risk of losing maybe maybe 3 days grazing or something at the back end.
So
40 kilos across the entire platform, like.
Yeah, so it doesn't really add up, to be honest with you, and you'll see in the milk production data that we'll show in a minute, even on the animal side, that grass is much more valuable in the spring than in the autumn.
Yeah, so your 270 a day kicks in versus your 180, like.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, no, we didn't do economics in this because it was kind of more of it wasn't a system study, but again, that's when that really comes into play in the autumn when you start looking at that side of things. Okay, so then this is just breaking this down slightly further. So what we did is we took the all of the paddocks and we broke them down into 5 different categories with a mean closing date of the first closing date one of the 4th of October, the second one then of the 19th of October, the 3rd of November, 18th of November, and the 3rd of December. So this is all the paddocks from all of the closing treatments that we had, and we broke them down into those 5 closing dates. So this is part of Caitlin Looney's work. And we followed those group of paddocks, individual paddocks and groups of paddocks over the winter for the 3 winters, and we looked at the individual growth rates on those paddocks on a 3-week window. So on the 12th of December, at the very start of January and the end of January, average across the first rotation and average across the second rotation. And okay, these figures are higher than what I presented earlier because it's taken individual paddocks rather than averaging it on each treatment. But I suppose the important thing to look at here is the first and second growth rate rotation on those groups of paddocks. So in the first rotation, the earliest closed group of paddocks, the earlier closed paddocks in closing date 1 and closing date 2 had a higher growth rate than the later closed paddocks in closing date 4 and closing date 5 in the spring. And that was completely driven by the amount of grass that was on those paddocks in the spring. They had a higher growth rate when we came into February and March and the very start of April. But when we started the second rotation, it completely shifted around. So those paddocks that had the highest cover over the winter and highest cover in spring had the lowest subsequent growth rate after they were grazed compared to the paddocks in the later closing category. They had a much higher regrowth, higher growth rates after being grazed in the first rotation. And this kind of leads back into that why we give the advice on your heavier closed paddocks or your first closed paddocks need to be gone out of the system by the start of March, somewhere around the 10th of March. Number one, because of quality, they're going to have a huge decline in the quality of grass on those because you're going to increase the amount of senesced and stem material in them. And it'll reduce cow performance, but also because of those heavier covers, they're going to have a lower growth rate on them once we graze them. It's important that they have them grazed early enough that they get a long enough interval before they're grazed again when they do have that slightly lower growth rate compared to the paddocks that have a lower opening farm, have a lower cover on them over the winter. Okay, so then this is just looking at the average residuals, post-grazing sward height, pre-grazing herbage mass that we had on those 3 treatments over the autumn period. And again, there wasn't a huge variation in those. The biggest one that we had was the silage offered. And I suppose it's much higher on the early closed treatment compared to the normal and the late. And that's because once those cows on the 9th of November on the early treatment, once they were housed, they were on full allocation of silage plus 3 kilos of concentrate, whereas the cows that were still grazing were on a grass-only diet. So that's an average over the 13-week period. But from the 9th of November, those early closed treatments were on full-time silage, and from the normal closed treatments on the 25th of November, they were on a full-time silage diet plus concentrate, whereas the late ones were still grazing grass. And what that meant in a feed budget, so there was a significant impact of silage on individual cow bases, but I suppose on cumulative silage fed over that 13-week period from December September to December, the early close treatment consumed 473 kilos of silage, the normal close treatment consumed 345, and the lates 163. And that is because once the cows were housed, they were on a full-time silage diet. However, the following spring, and I know I'm bringing in the spring data here, but the following spring, we did have a lower opening farm cover on the late treatment compared to the normal, so and the yearly. So we did have to put in more silage in the spring. So in the yearly, we put in 13 kilos in silage from February to May. The normal 178 and the late 250. So if we add those together, there's about 100 kilos extra silage going in on the early close treatment versus the late close treatment when you add the autumn and the spring period together, by getting those extra months longer grazing in the autumn period, reducing your farm cover, and you'll see then when we come to the milk production data in the spring, the significant impact that 250 kilos of silage had in the spring on the late treatment versus the 473 kilos of silage that had on animal production in late lactation. So we look at milk production. There was no significant effect in autumn on closing date on daily milk yield. So all three groups of cows had the exact same daily milk production, averaging about 13.3 litres per cow per day. Milk solids, something similar, average about 1.23 kilos of milk solids per cow per day. I know the difference looks much bigger here, but it's only 0.2 of a kilo of milk solids. The axis doesn't go down to zero. But when we look at protein, there was a higher protein concentration on the late close treatment versus the early and the normal close treatment. And that was completely driven by once the cows on the early treatment were housed on the 9th of November, they were on a full-time silage diet and protein concentration reduced. And on average, it reduced by 0.15 or 0.16 of a percentage on average over the full autumn period. So it did have a significant effect on protein, but again, quite minimal. But that extra silage going in the autumn period didn't impact late lactation, daily milk yield, or milk solids production on those cows.
Was it significant between the medium and the late there, Mike? The error bars look like they're relatively close enough to meet
so the medium and the late were not significantly different in terms of crude protein concentration, because the medium treatment were only on silage for 2 weeks. Now, for those 2-week period, they did have a lower concentration of protein, but on average over the period, it wasn't significant, whereas the early close treatment was significantly lower compared to the medium and the late.
Okay. Thanks.
And that's because of that month silage going in, full-time silage in that period, whereas the medium only had 2 weeks and the late only had a small amount of silage going in due to weather conditions.
And would you just comment on the quality of the silage just for...
Yeah, so it was the silage DMD was 70% DMD, so it was average to good quality silage. The grass quality, I think I have a slide coming up there on the grass quality. I can't remember, but the grass quality on the late closed treatment actually was lower compared to the earlier or the medium low closed treatment over the period, and that's because we had to build up a much higher peak farm cover in the autumn to allow us to continue grazing out till the 9th of December without having to put in a huge amount of silage. So we built up a peak farm cover of 1,400 kilos on that late closed treatment. So we were grazing covers of 3,100, 3,200 in November on that late closed treatment. So that did have a reduction in grass quality. Whereas the silage going in on the late close treatment was similar. So overall, feed quality input, including the silage and of the grass, it was similar on all treatments across the period, because we did have higher quality grass on the early, coupled with the poor quality silage going in, whereas the late had a poor quality grazed grass going in because of the high pre-grazing hovers, high stem and dead material in those paddocks as well. So that's kind of it on the autumn, Stuart, if there's any questions there before I move on to the spring.
No, I think you're okay at the moment, and we don't have anything after coming in yet.
Yeah, so on some of the spring data, so although we had the 3 opening farm covers in the spring, what we also looked at was spring rotation planner length. So we looked at again, normal rotation planner, which was 30% grazed by the 1st of March, 66% grazed by the 17th of March, and we finished the first rotation on the 8th of April. And then we imposed a fast rotation, so we had 40% grazed on the 1st of March, 75% grazed by the 17th of March, and we started the second rotation on the 1st of April. So each of the opening farm covers, so the high, medium, and high, normal, and low, or the early, medium, and the early, normal, and late closing dates, had 2 spring rotation planners, so a normal and a fast. So the high opening farm cover had a normal rotation and a fast rotation. The medium opening farm cover had a normal and a fast rotation, and then the late had a normal and a fast rotation as well over the period. So effectively, what that gave us, even though we had the same pre-grazing cover within the high opening farm cover, we had 2 areas which gave us a higher allowance on the fast rotation, because we were giving them an extra 10% over that extra 28 days in February. They had a higher grass availability to those in the spring period. And I suppose the reason that we looked at this was, is it going to increase animal performance? Number one, by giving them a higher grass allowance in the spring, but grazing off these paddocks earlier and a higher percentage of them in February, will it increase the amount of grass that we have available on farm at the start of the second rotation? And I'll go through some of the results there in a minute. Again, everything was the exact same across it. In this, we had 15 groups of 15 treatments, or 15 cows per each of the treatments, whereas in the autumn we had 30 cows. We had assimilated an 80% 6-week calving rate, which was the exact same on all of the 6 treatments. We had a common turnout date of the 5th of February on average across the 3 years. And we had a set area allocation per day based on the normal or the fast rotation. All cows received the same amount of concentrate of 3 kilos. We did have to go up in March of 18 with the bad weather. We did go up to 5 kilos of concentrate during that period of very wet and snow and cold weather, but it was generally set at 3 kilos of concentrate across the spring. And if an individual group needed, if residual went below 3 centimeters, they were supplemented with grass silage, not concentrate. So concentrate was the exact same across all treatments. So the only difference here again was the area, the grass availability, and the amount of silage that they were fed.
Okay, and all groups would have gotten the 5 kilos when they
Yes,
needed
so
it.
concentrate was always the same, and that was just for a 3-week period in March, in that very, very cold and wet and snowy weather, that they went up to 5 kilos, and all groups would have got at the exact same time, and for the exact same amount of period as well, and then we went back down to 3 kilos. But if an individual group was short, or the residual went below 3 centimeters, they were supplemented with grass silage.
Okay.
Again, these are just some of the measurements that we took on the treatment. So again, herbage quality, proportion, area, and milk results as well. So in terms of the herbage production results from rotation 1 alone, so the high opening farm cover, which averaged 1,100 kilos, did increase up our pre-grazing sward height, and going from the high to the low opening farm cover, it reduced pre-grazing sward height by 1.5 centimeters. Again, that had a significant impact on residuals. So we had a much lower residual on the medium and the normal treatment compared to the high treatment, of about 0.34 of a centimeter reduction. So again, they were still within Teagasc recommendations of 3.5, give or take. So the high treatment had a residual of 3.7, and the medium and the low had a residual of 3.5 and 3.4 centimeters on average over the 3 years. Pre-grazing herbage mass, similar story here. It was much lower on the medium and the normal compared to the high, and going from the high to the low, it reduced pre-grazing sward height on average over the first rotation by 468 kilos. So from 1,400 kilos down to just under an average pre-grazing sward height of 1,000 on the low with the medium intermediate. And then again, I suppose this is the main one here on daily herbage allowance. So we had a large reduction in daily herbage allowance as a result of the lower pre-grazing sward height and pre-grazing herbage mass. So again, going from the high to the low, we reduced. So each cow received 3.8 kilos less grass in the spring period on the low versus the medium, versus the high treatment with medium intermediate. So again, that's some of the herbage production from the first rotation. When we look at the herbage reduction, when we look at the fast and the slow, so I suppose the main hypothesis we had when we were looking at it, by increasing the amount of ground that we're grazing in February, it would potentially give us a higher, because we'll have more grouse grazed earlier, we'll have a longer time to recover. When we get to the second round, it's going to have a higher grass availability and growth rates on those paddocks. That wasn't actually the case. So if we look at the rotation 1, here, and rotation 2 here for the fast and the slow. So there was no major impact on daily herbage allowance, no significant impact on daily herbage allowance in rotation 1 between the fast and the slow. Slightly higher on the fast compared to the slow or the normal, and this was on average across the 3 opening farm covers just here. But when we got to the second rotation, by imposing a fast spring rotation in the first round, we reduced grass availability to those cows in the second rotation by about 2.5 kilos per cow on average over the second rotation compared to the normal. And I suppose that was as a main result of poor growth rates that we had received in some of the springs, but particularly it came as a result of opening farm cover. So this is the interaction then between the fast and the slow and the high opening farm covers on pre-grazing sward height. So again, we have the high opening farm cover, which was much higher on the fast. But when we look at the low and the medium opening farm covers, they had a much lower daily pre-grazing herbage mass and subsequently daily herbage allowance in the second rotation compared to the slow for their counterparts on the medium and the low treatments. So what that tells us, if you want to impose a fast spring rotation planner or increase the amount of area that you're grazing in February and March, you need to have a very high opening farm cover available on farm to be able to do that. Because if you have a very low opening farm cover and you increase the amount of grass that you're going to graze or allocate to these cows, it is going to reduce the amount of grass that you have on farm available when you start the second round in April. And again, this is just looking at it in the second rotation. So again, no difference in the fast or the slow in year 1 on average. But when we had a poor growth rate in 2018, the fast rotation had a much lower pre-grazing herbage mass in the second round compared to the slow. However, the counterpart happened then in year 3 when we had very high growth rates in year 3. The fast rotation had a not significant but slightly higher pre-grazing herbage mass available in the second round compared to the slow spring rotation planner. So again, if you want to impose this fast rotation, you need to have adequate grass on farm at turnout to be able to impose that fast spring rotation planner, but also you need adequate growth rates on farm to be able to support that higher growth rate to get to that earlier start date of the second rotation.
So Mike, should the plan actually be the 30%, and then if the growth rates are actually good, you push up the extra percentage during the month of February rather than planning for it? Like,
I think for these very high stocking rate farms, I think the spring rotation planner can be used as a single tool in February, whether it is 30 or 40%. But I think you have to move to a combination of the spring rotation planner and average farm cover, monitoring your average farm cover weekly from March in combination with your spring rotation planners. Because if even if you graze 40% in February, if you realize earlier enough in March that your farm cover is dropping by walking your farm frequently enough, there is time to slow down the rotation, bring in the rains, slow down the rotation, put in silage or concentrate to slow down the cows earlier enough in March, rather than realizing when you get to the end of March and not having looking at your average farm cover and continue on with a high daily area allowance when you get to the end of March that you're after dropping your farm cover too low. So I think in February we can use as a sole tool the spring rotation planner, whether it be 30 or 40%. However, when we get into March, you have to move away from a single use of the spring rotation planner, and it must be used in combination with the average farm cover management across that spring period.
But do you make the differentiation between the 30 and the 40% at the start of February when you see what your opening cover is what you're suggesting?
So you can only really do that.
Good overwinter growth, like you could make the decision.
Yeah, so like if you have an opening farm cover of 700 on the 1st of February, there's no way you can go, based on the results from this, there's no way you can go and do a 40% in February, because if you do 40% in February on a 700 opening farm cover, you're going to reduce your farm cover very, very quickly over that February period, and you're really going to have to pull the reins quite severely in March to not let your farm cover dip below that kind of 600, 550 kilo target before the average farm cover beside the second round. Whereas if you have an average farm cover of up on 1,000 or 1,100 kilos, it's a lot easier to do that 40% in February if you have the mouth power to do it, and then pull the reins or release the reins in March, depending on growth rates and your farm cover that you have. And you can see that there when we had very good growth rates in year 3, And you've seen it on a lot of farms. A lot of farms didn't finish the first round, or they shouldn't have finished the first round in 2019 because of the exceptionally high growth rates that we got
They just couldn't keep
in
up with it.
March of that. Exactly, yeah. So whereas if they had been less conservative in February and given them more grass because of the high farm cover that they had and the high growth rates that they were getting, they would have got through the first round and started earlier. But sometimes you see people not starting the first round on time, continue to finish, or starting the second round on time, and continue to graze the first round. Even though there's adequate grass back on the start of the second round, they should pull out of it and start again.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Some of the that's just the same data again, presented a slightly different way. In terms of quality, then you can see the proportion of leaf and stem and dead material. So there was a higher proportion of green leaf material percentage-wise on the late treatment versus the early treatment, and that's because we had slightly higher dead and stem material on the early treatment versus the late, which did have a significant impact on sward quality. So we had a higher OMD percentage, so 85 versus 83 on the late versus the early, because we had that higher stem and dead material. But just looking at percentages or proportions doesn't really add up. And if you look at the quantities of grass that we had in terms of the high opening farm cover, we still had a higher proportion or quantity of green leaf available to those earlier high opening farm cover versus the low opening farm cover, because we had more grass available. But even though we had a lower sward quality, because we had more grass available rather than putting in silage, it did have a significant impact on daily milk yield. So the high opening farm cover had a significantly greater, on average over the first rotation, higher daily milk yield compared to the medium and the low treatment. And that was as a result of that increase in daily herbage allowance that I showed earlier on. And for every increase, 1 kilo increase in daily herbage allowance, it increased daily milk production over the first round by 0.38 of a kilo per cow per day. That was similar then for milk solids. So again, much higher milk solids on the high versus the low treatments and the medium treatments, intermediate, compared to them. And that was because we had a much higher grass allowance going into those cows. We had less silage going into the high opening farm cover versus the low. Whereas when we would go back to the autumn period, even though we had more silage going in to the cows in late lactation when we housed them, we didn't see that significant reduction in daily milk yield or milk solids. Although we had a small reduction in protein concentration, overall it didn't actually impact late lactation animal performance the same way that silage going in or extra grass going into the cow's diet does in early lactation.
Okay.
Okay, so again, some practical implications there. So it just reiterates again the importance of grass in early lactation. Again, 1 kilo increase for 0.3 of a kilo in milk production for every kilo increase in daily herbage allowance. The longer effects, so that reduction in sward quality that we have in spring by the earlier closing date, although it reduces sward quality, it doesn't actually significantly impact early lactation milk production because of the high proportion of grass. So it's still a very good quality feed, even though it was 2 percentage units lower OMD, it's still a much higher quality feed than grass silage. Again, the consequences of that fast and normal spring rotation planner, again, like we discussed there, it's going to reduce, if you don't have a high enough opening farm cover or high enough growth rates to sustain that, it is going to reduce pre-grazing herbage mass, daily herbage allowance, and silage requirements when we go into the second rotation by imposing that fast rotation planner. So again, it can only really happen if you have a high enough opening farm cover in February and you have high enough growth rates to sustain that, so you can start the second round on the 1st of April. Again, we did drop our farm covers quite low on some of these treatments. We didn't put any limit on what we drop our farm cover to, but when we did go below 550 kilos of an average farm cover in spring, it did have significant impacts on regrowth of those swards, and that was really seen in the late close treatment in the first 2 years and the medium treatment in the second year, because of that huge reduction we had in opening farm cover and average farm cover drop across the year. Again, late lactation milk production in autumn, housing the cows earlier didn't significantly impact overall milk production, and having that extra silage going in, we did see a small reduction in protein. But the demand for grass in spring should really drive all of your decision making on farm around that autumn closing pattern and requirement that you have on your farm for the spring period. So that's kind of it on the trial. I have just that Excel thing that I was talking about before, Stuart, with the different target farm cover that you have depending on stocking rate that we can go through in a minute.
Yeah, I think that's well worth looking at again, because it's useful for just making it clear as to why we are saying to people to close up. I suppose, Mike, I'm going to play devil's advocate here now. The
Yeah,
people on the heavy soils, they get a good
yeah,
back end. They just keep going because they mightn't
yeah,
get the opportunity to go in February. What are your
yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, and Donald was even talking about that up in Donald Patton and Ballyhaise yesterday, talking about it, and like what he would suggest that he has ground, that kind of low land ground that floods. Um, but again, if he closes his or drops his farm cover very low in the autumn, um, what he actually does is he actually really hammers over winter growth rate, because it's generally colder on some of those heavier soils. You get a lower over winter growth rate. So if okay, if you can't get out in the 1st of February, maybe you don't require an opening farm cover of 1,000 kilos. But because there's generally a lower overwinter growth rates, there can still be a requirement for a slightly earlier closing date, even to get an opening farm cover of 750 or 800, compared to what would happen on some of the freer draining soils. But again, Donald's advice would be that he has ground that floods, that he grazes it when he can. He doesn't generally include that in his first rotation, so it's a bonus if he gets entered into the first round or the last round. And he does his autumn and spring budget excluding that very wet ground that he may or may not get to. So although some of the heavier ground may not be able to get out on the 1st of February, and they may not require a opening farm cover of 1,000 kilos, they still have a higher requirement for grass in spring versus autumn, and there is still benefits. Even if it gets out for 3 to 4 hours a day, there are still significant benefits of getting out there earlier in spring on some of those heavier soils. And the heavy soil program would show that as well, that even when they do get out, and sometimes they can't, but when they do get out uh, earlier in spring compared to some of the very wet years, they do see a significant increase in milk production in the tank. So although you may not require an opening farm cover of 1,000 or 1,100 kilos, it's farm specific, but you should still prioritize the spring as much as possible over the autumn in that grass availability.
So in a way, you're possibly answering the question. So there are some farms that we do come across, and I, as you said, Donald kind of did allude to it yesterday when we were talking about it, that you just have to tailor the advice a small bit. That in reality, it's very difficult for them to get out in the
Yeah,
early
in
part of
February.
February
Yeah,
for definite, and possibly a lot of the month of February in some cases. But
yeah,
the fact that their soil temperature is probably going to be lower because the ground is colder and wetter, they should still be trying to
yeah,
close on target, for the
yeah.
right
And
target
when
price.
when in I can't remember when exactly they started the project up in Ballyhaise first, but when they just took the blueprint from Moore Park on the 10th of the 7th to the 10th of October, what it was at the
Yeah, it was
time, and just put it into
2008, I think.
Ballyhaise.
Yeah,
2008, yeah, they hammered their overwinter growth rates, and they effectively grew nothing over the winter period because they tried to graze out until that end of November period, and they had no growth rate over the winter, and effectively their average farm cover increased by, I think it was a 25 or 30 kilos on average. But he has since tailored it for his conditions, and every farm is unique. But again, because of that lower overwinter growth rate and colder soil, so lower soil temperatures, you are going to get lower overwinter growth rates. So there still may be requirement for slightly altering your autumn closing pattern, whether it be going slightly earlier on your closing dates or not. But you try and have to get the grass that you require on spring, whether it's the 15th of February turnout date or the 20th of February turnout date or the 1st of March. If you still require an 800 kilos of an average farm cover at that date, you may not get it by grazing out until December if you get a good back end, because you will have a lower overwinter growth rate. So you have to tailor it for that farm. And although they don't need 1,000, they may need 750, 800. They will have a lower overwinter growth rate. And Donal and Ballyhaise has shown that over the last 12 years up there, that they cannot graze late, because if they do, they have nothing in the spring.
so I just happen to have that graph there that we're talking about from the conversation we were having yesterday. So you can see it
Yeah,
there, that this is what Mike is talking about when they imposed the closing cover targets that were there at the time from Moore Park on the Ballyhaise farm. That you got this very, very low level of overwinter growth. So you can see that this is 400 here, and they barely struck to 500 to start. So they were beaten before they started, even in the springtime, because they
yeah,
were going to struggle to keep the farm cover at the right level for the start of the second rotation. Whereas as we've moved on, 8 years later now, you can see closing at a lot higher cover. And then the actual, I suppose, the theory of grass grows grass. The grass is keeping a bit of heat in the ground as well, keeping the temperature slightly elevated. And as a result, they're able to open at the right cover. And I think, as I said, if ground does get flooded and is saturated and whatever, it's not going to grow anyway. So there's you have to compensate for that by closing at the right level. And as we said, closing the right fields maybe. So there's no point in having a big cover of grass in a field that's beside a river that's going to get flooded. You need to get that cleaned out.
Exactly, and what they do and what Donald does in Ballyhaise is he has maybe 20% of his farm that can flood at any time. So he generally doesn't include that in his autumn planner or his spring rotation planner or spring feed budgets. But if he gets to it, it's a bonus. It means he has less silage to go in and he's extra grass available. But if it's ground that in 1 year out of 5 you can only get to it, it probably shouldn't be included in your spring budget or your autumn budget, because it will be extremely difficult. And if you include that in it, and you haven't a hope of getting it 4 years out of 5 because it's wet or flood or whatever for every reason, it probably shouldn't be included in that final round or the first round. But if you do get to it on a good year, it's an extra bonus that you have that extra grass available. And I think that's kind of the principle that Donald works on. He can graze it when he grazes it. And if he gets to it, it's an extra bonus in the first round or the last round.
And I suppose it goes back to the word that I said to you earlier, being dynamic all the time. So like when if an opportunity comes to graze that ground, people have to skip out and graze it potentially because there might only be a week window or whatever. And then come
exactly. So I think I think you have to. So in terms of the autumn growth rates that you're going to see there, and spring, you have to change and adapt rather than just doing the same thing. Whether it be your autumn closing date to get the closing farm cover you want on the 1st of December, or whether it be spring grassland management in terms of when you're going to start your second round or what percentage should you graze or what should your farm cover be. You have to change every time, and you can only do that really by monitoring your average farm cover in conjunction with your autumn planner and your spring planner. And particularly on a heavier soil, it's a lot trickier too, but there's a lot more changing, that if you get a wet week in some of that ground you can't go at all, but if you get a dry week you take your opportunities when you can.
Okay. No, you'll have
and I think was it Donald said box and smart.
Yes, definitely. You'll have to share again now just to show the Excel, because I stopped your share when I put up that slide. So, I suppose it's been dynamic. I suppose people on the call.
You'll have to stop sharing there first, George.
Sorry, no problem. People on the call. It's a case of knowing the farm that you're dealing with, I suppose, and knowing the soil type that people are dealing with too, and being realistic in terms of our expectations and also maybe tempering some of their expectations in terms of what they can achieve.
Just kind of one thing before we finish up there then. So what does your farm cover be for your farm? Look, I've presented data there on the benefits of having that higher opening farm cover of 1,100 kilos on average and the benefits you can get in spring. But if you haven't got that spring demand, or if you higher spring demand, you need to alter your closing farm covers more so for your farm, and that depends on your spring demand, so your stocking rate, your calving pattern, your overwinter growth rate capacity of your farm, your spring growth rate capacity of your farm, and do it. So look, this is just a typical feed budget. I'm not going to go through it in detail of what we would have looked at. So peaking at 1,200 kilos, housing the cows at 670, or closing cover on the 1st of December at 670, opening farm cover of 950, and then your magic day dropping your farm cover below 550. That's kind of the targets that we would have worked off and over the last couple of years. Again, but one blueprint is not going to fit all, and you're going to get variations and fluctuations in growth rate too. So what I just did is I looked at 3 different stocking rates and worked backwards from that kind of start of the second round, and I put in 600 kilos of a target average farm cover. It should be between 550 and 600 kilos. If we go below that 5 or 500 kilos, 550 or 500 kilos, it is going to reduce your growth rates for the subsequent 3 weeks afterwards. So again, it's kind of, to get the opening farm cover that you require for an individual farm, it's working backwards from that kind of 600 kilos, and you can go even further if you want to. So if we look at your spring demand on a farm, so stocked at 2.5 cows per hectare, we're just up here at the top now, on average over February, depending on the calving pattern, and I think I simulated these at an 85% 6-week calving rate, we have an average stocking rate in February of 1.3 cows per hectare. average grass dry matter intake, including concentrate and silage, over the month of February is 7 kilos. So that's a demand per day of 9 kilos of grass consumed per day over the 28 days in February, or whatever number of days it is you're grazing in February. That's a grass eaten of 255 kilos. Likewise, then in March, our stocking rate has increased because we have more cows calved. Our grass allocation has increased up to 11, higher intakes. Again, 25 kilos consumed per day, grass per cow by our stocking rate. That's 767 kilos of a drop in average farm cover with no growth. And then when we get to April, the first 5 days in April to the 5th, full stocking rate, eating 14 kilos, reduction in farm cover by 175 kilos. And I suppose it's interesting to note that most of the reduction in your spring grass supply happens in March, because that's when you have the highest intake and for the longest period compared to February. So this is when you generally see the largest decline in your average farm cover. And that's why it's very important to walk your farm a minimum of 3 times in March to monitor your farm cover, because that is the time that you see the biggest reduction in your average farm cover. But if we add those three grass eaten periods together, we're going to consume, or that at a stocking rate of 2.5 is going to consume just shy of 1,200 kilos of dry matter over that 55 day period, or whatever it is. If we look at growth rates over the same period, 28 days in February, again, turnout date can vary, so it might not be full 28 days in February. Average growth rate of 8 kilos, we're going to grow 224. We're eating 255, so we have a reduction. In March, we're going to grow 18 kilos over the 31 days. It may be higher, it may be lower for an individual farm. We're going to grow 560, however, we're dropping 760, so 200 kilos of a difference. And in April, then we have a growth rate of 30 for the 5 days, so we're going to grow 150 kilos during that period. So we'll consume 1,200 kilos, but we're going to grow 930 kilos. So on total, we're going to drop our average farm cover in the spring period by 265. So if we do not want to drop our farm cover below 600 kilos in April, at the start of April, our opening farm cover, because this is what we're going to drop it by, must be 865 kilos for a farm stocked at 2.5 livestock units per hectare with this calving pattern and this growth rates. So again, each individual calving pattern for a farm is different, and each growth rate in spring for an individual farm is different too. So that's why having that data for an individual farm is so important. But again, to work back then what your closing farm cover should be, in December, if you're going to, from the 1st of December, if you're going to grow 4 kilos in December, 3 kilos in January, again, they can vary. That's a growth rate of 217 over that period. You take that from your 865, your closing farm cover on the 1st of December needs to be 400 or 648 kilos of dry matter per hectare to have an opening farm cover of 865. So again, it's about working backwards to what the individual farm stocking or opening farm cover should be for an individual stocking rate and an individual calving pattern and growth rates on spring. And if we just take the same calving pattern and same growth rates that we have here, just for simplicity, we look at a stocking rate of 2.7 cows per hectare. Again, same target of 600 kilos here. Higher stocking rate in the period, same grass allocation. We need an opening farm cover of 970. At the same overwinter growth rates, we need to close that farm at 770 kilos. So we do not drop our farm cover below 600 on the 5th of April. And likewise then, if you're stocked at 3 cows per hectare, you need 1,112 kilos of dry matter of an average opening farm cover and a closing farm cover on the 1st of December of just under 900 kilos. So again, this is just 3 fictitious stocking rates, spring demands and growth rate in spring and winter that you have done, but it just highlights the difference that each individual farm has, the demand that you have on that farm. And I suppose the results of this trial show that spring grass is key in terms of increasing milk production, reducing costs, and each individual farm is different, but you must what the grass required on farm and your farm in spring and work backwards then to get that closing farm cover, and you alter your closing management in order to achieve that closing cover that you require.
Okay, Mike, I suppose you might just clarify the 1.6 of the stocking rate demand for February. How did you come up with that one?
Yeah, so that's just, look, if we look at I think was this on a 40 hectare farm at an 85% 6-week calving rate and a turnout date on the 5th or 6th of February. So if we look at that calving pattern and we looked at the calving pattern that we had used here for the trial in Moore Park, you're not going to have a full stocking rate in February because not all of your cows are going to be calved. There's going to be a lot of them inside. And although you may have a high percentage calved in February, they're not going to be all grazing for the month of February, because there's some going to calve in the second half of February. So on average, at the end of February, you may have a stocking rate of 2 cows per hectare or 2.2 cows per hectare, but on average over the entire month, because you're starting with a very low number in the first week of February, it's much lower. So that's the average stocking rate over the 28 days, based on an 80% 6-week calving rate turning out on I think it was the 3rd or 4th of February I picked on that. So that's where that 1.6 comes from, and it is increasing then as the year goes on, because although you have a stocking rate of 3, you don't have a stocking rate of 3 in February, or you generally don't have a stocking rate of 3 in March, because you're not going to have all your cows calved on day 1.
Okay.
But and again, that's very easy to get. You can simulate that on what your calving pattern will be on ICBF, and then look at the number of cows that will be, what your available ground is in the first round, to calculate that average stocking rate for each week and each month of the spring period.
And you can put in the cows calved each week on pasture base as well as you go do your
Yeah,
spring
exactly. Yeah, to get that demand. Yeah, so again, you can use your pasture base to get that grass consumed, and you can calculate back then to get your opening and closing farm cover doing it this way.
Okay, very good. So you've either baffled people, or you've given a very comprehensive presentation, and I think it's probably the latter of the two anyway. So no questions from the audience at the moment. I suppose that you summarised it in one sentence for me there before, in relation to the study and the closing cover. Like, it kind of nearly, it didn't matter what you did in terms of closing. I can't remember how you put it again. If you can think of what you said, actually, I thought it was very good summary. I can't remember it now exactly what it was, but
I probably can't remember it either. I talked too much.
It was more or less that you could do whatever you wanted to do, but closing at the wrong cover was ultimately.
Yeah, you look at the autumn period is not the critical point. It's the spring period, and how you manage the cows in terms of late lactation, feeding wise. It didn't have a significant impact on milk production in the back end. But what you did in the back end had a huge impact on the amount of milk production in the spring period. So the autumn, you can not get away with it, but it's not. You should prioritize your spring grass over getting that an extra week or an extra 10 days grazing in the autumn if you're going to drop your farm cover too low.
Okay. I think we'll leave it at that, so seeing as we have no questions. So thanks a million, Mike, for your time.
No trouble.
And thanks to everyone else for tuning in. And we'll be back again the second Wednesday of next month as well. So talk to you then.